you.
Yeah.
Okay, do I have to press on continue? Okay. So once again, thank you very much, Maria. Thank you, George, also for the invitation. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be in Exeter, let's say virtually at least, and welcome to all of you at the end of this kind of long semester. Now, the title of my talk, Disability and Technology, with a little help from technology, animals and people, might sound a bit informal, a bit casual, and that's exactly how it is meant to be. Because one of the main points of this presentation will be that these things we are actually caring for, so the technology to help disabled people, that these things were there in antiquity, but that it was hardly an issue to them and that it was hardly ever problematized. This will be the main point I will try to prove in this lecture. And it will be mainly based on my book, which George also mentioned, but which came out in 2014 for the first time in a Dutch version. So I just took this one to make it look a bit more exotic, also because it has this full cover of a mosaic, which is found in Spain, in Plaza de la Corredera in Cordoba. And we're not really sure what is depicted here, but we think that this is actually from a comedy or even a mime, a sort of parody of the Oedipus myth, where you actually see not only the big mask for the theater, but also blind Oedipus finding his way just using this stuff. And it looks really like the person who is depicted is blind or at least not seeing very well. Okay, here we go. I'd like to start, we're not going to make this an interactive seminar, but I'd just like to start with a question for you. What do people nowadays associate most with the term disabilities? And then the second is a question for me or for all scholars studying disabilities. What are the questions you get most often as an historian of disabilities? What are the things that journalists often ask you when you say, well, I actually studied disabilities in the past? Well, first thing is based on research that was done some years ago in Germany. When you just go on the street and ask people, what is your first thought when disability is mentioned? It turns out that the two most popular themes are Down syndrome and, for our technology, being in a wheelchair. And the question, or the answer to the second question, what is the question you most often get as a historian of disabilities? Well, for me, it's always that question on what I would call in Latin the prima causa. So what was the first time that, and so on? What was the first time that we discover a wheelchair in antiquity? What is the first time we hear about hearing aids, about guide dogs, about prosthesis, and so on and so on? Questions that are being asked. Okay. Now, first of all, when we want to discuss technology, or when we want to discuss anything as prosthesis in antiquity, then we have to acknowledge first that all these terms like technology and also prosthesis for sure, are modern concepts. There is that, I'm glad George already mentioned it, that beautiful collective volume edited by Jane Draycott on prosthesis in antiquity, where you can actually read that in ancient Greek, the word prosthesis is actually a grammatical term, mainly. It can also be used for application of medical equipment, like a pessary or cupping vessel and things like that. But when you go to the modern definition, which would be something like an artificial device that replaces or augments a missing or impaired part of the body, well, that meaning is just not there in antiquity. It also brings up the question as to whether this was, as to why this never was a theme in ancient medicine. So ancient doctors would never mention prosthesis. And this also brings up the question of a possible concept of revalidation being there in ancient medicine. Also, this is very difficult. So every now and then in the Hippocratic corpus, you will find indications on patients recovering and so on and so on. But the whole concept of revalidation, in my view, was not really there. A point that Jane Drackett made, and rightly so, I'd say, is that perhaps an important difference between antiquity and nowadays is that in antiquity, they would mostly use expressions that say something like a leg of wood. So with the emphasis on the leg, instead of saying, as we do it often nowadays, a prosthetic leg. Now, the fact that there was no ancient concept of prosthesis or technology helping the disabled doesn't, well, is important, of course, but it doesn't really matter for our research. Let me explain myself. In antiquity, for instance, there was no concept of homosexuality. But of course, one can study homosexuality also in antiquity. There wasn't even, which I've written several times, there wasn't even a real concept of disability. But still, of course, we can study disabilities in the ancient past too. So we shouldn't be worried too much about this. Now, what will I focus on during this presentation? Well, as it is kind of a vague concept, if you start from ancient concepts, I would like to focus on instruments, on human beings helping, so being helpers or slaves. Mind that in Roman legislation, slaves are called instrumentum vocale. And also, third one, animals, for which I not really discovered, but I just read through this marvelous source, which is Aelian or Aelianus, who basically lived end of the second, beginning of the 3rd century, so in times of the Severan dynasty, and who has that marvelous, it has been called appealing collection of facts and fables, where he actually wants to contrast the animal kingdom with the kingdom of human beings. Okay. Let's just start with helpers or slaves. This is for those of you who perhaps teach Latin or Latin literature. This is one of my favorite passages from Pliny the Younger, and it's actually about his uncle, Pliny the Elder, who is like a super scholar. He does not want to waste 1 minute. He always wants to work. As you know, also it is said that Pliny the Elder was kind of obese, and that he had a problem that might have been perhaps what we would recognize nowadays as asthma. Now, when you just go through this text with your students, you could ask them about the passive forms. Everything is, as it were, in the Latin and also in the translation, in passive. A book was read. He was bathed. He was read to, and dictation was taken. And so on and so on. So you can basically read it for yourself. So he even as a stenographer, taking notes for him. He was carried around Rome in a chair, and so on and so on. Now, most of you will know that Pliny the Elder dies because of his strive, of his curiosity also for scholarship, because when the Vesuvius erupted, he of course wanted to go and see what was happening. And here you see a kind of 19th century French picture, and the text again by Pliny the Younger, telling about the death of Pliny the Elder. I will just read one short passage. Leaning on two young slaves, he got up and straightway fell down. As I gather, his breath blocked by the thickening vapors, and with his esophagus choked, it had always been weak and narrow, frequently inflamed. When it was light again, on the third day from the one he'd last seen, his body was found intact, unhurt, and dressed just as he had been. His appearance was more like a man sleeping than one dead. If you read this with students, or I'd say with pupils, surely when they are younger, they tend to speak up about these things, they will immediately ask you, what happened to these slaves? Where are they? He was leaning on two young slaves, okay? Afterwards, he dies. Where are they? They're just not mentioned. It's as if they were his instruments in a way, and in the end, they are not that important. Presumably, they had sort of accompanied him during all his life, or at least parts of his life. Okay. Let's go to animals. Well, I've actually been browsing to these On the Nature of Animals, this beautiful book by Alien, and I have been searching for aid, support, help, and so on and so on. But I have to admit that I didn't find much. There's one passage on elephants helping human beings. There are some passages on dolphins being very helpful for people living near the coast and having friendships and so on and so on, a thing you also read with Pliny the Younger, as you may know. But a remarkable passage is the following one on a monkey. It's actually very cruel. What is it about? It is about a monkey observing a nurse washing a baby. And when the nurse goes away, the monkey just takes over. And what is he doing? He is just putting the baby in a tub, but this was a tub full of boiling water, and the poor baby dies. Now, when I saw this fragment, and by the way, I have to thank Marco Vespa from the University of Fribourg, who wrote an article about this and who kind of drew my attention to it. When you read this article, this passage, you will start thinking about monkeys. Monkeys that are actually nowadays also used to, they're clever animals, they're used to help disabled people. And you could say, well, what is this? Is this ancient writers kind of recognizing that a monkey might be useful for helping you? And it's an interesting insight, but at the same time, by reading it like this, you don't do justice to the text. Because Alien's point is that the monkey is the most mischievous, kakoethestaton, of all animals. And he is so because it constantly wants to imitate humans. And then bad things happen, as the thing which is illustrated here. This fits also in a context where there's a fable also about a monkey wanting to become a fisherman. So the context is totally different. There might be that thought that monkeys can do things human beings can do, okay? But that is as far as it gets. There's nothing else here really on monkeys helping people. I also went through some articles in the wonderful D'Arambert et Saglio, where they deal with all these animals, but I at least didn't find anything more there. Neither did Marco Vespa and Arnold Zucker. Oh, okay. Now, for the rest of this lecture, I will focus on instruments, and I will use the from head to toe approach. So I will go a capite ad calcem. So some things will be said about vision and eyes, something will be said about ears, something about speaking and the mouth, and then something, of course, about mobility impairment. By the way, everything you see here are ex-votos found near sanctuaries, and we suppose that these are actually people asking for help for a problem with their vision, with their ears, and so on and so on. Okay, let's see. I really discovered, that's why I was so glad with the invitation, I really discovered like some nice and intriguing things in going through the material again. So that question like, is there any talk in antiquity about a guide dog? Well, the closest you get is this one. It's a fresco, which is actually found in the end of the 19th century already in Pompeii. And first you have to have a look at the left. So that it's actually how the fresco looked like and still looks like. And then, of course, these are these famous late 19th century archaeological drawings, just trying to reconstruct the fresco. Is it sure that this is a beggar? I'd say yes. Somebody is giving him some money or anything else, of course. And there is a dog, of course, and there is a staff. Is this sure that this is a guide dog and that this is a blind person? Well, some publications, and you find it just when you go to the internet, I think already Wikipedia will say it. Well, this is the first instance of a guide dog, but I'm not that sure at all. And there's no other reference to guide dogs in antiquity. Now, of course, focusing on vision first, blind people or people with poor vision wanted to be helped. And these are just extracts I took from my book, which you saw already. So there's talk about, of course, a guide, which is often ducem in Latin, when you just want to wander around. There is talk also in the second fragment, taken from Plutarch, the life of Pyrrhus, on there's talk of attendants. So Appius Claudius is then taken by his attendants, carried on a litter through the forum to the Senate house. And then when he actually reaches the Senate house, it's his close relatives, his sons and his sons-in-law, who took him up in their arms and brought them inside. Of course, there's also talk, in the case of blind people, of crutches, staffs also. This is a nice one from Isidore of Sevilla, who is always into these etymologies. He will say, well, where does the cognomen Scipio come from? Well, this is actually because a father of one of these Scipios in the forum was walking around. That father was blind, caecus, and he was inixus. He was just leaning on Scipio Scipionis, which means also a staff, a walking staff. So there's that connection between being blind, having to use this Scipio, and therefore the cognomen Scipio. And then there's an intriguing fragment, I guess, in the Tristia by Ovid, saying, we make way, both for the blind and for those whom the praetexta and the imperious rods with their cries make reverent. So when a consul or something with his lictores comes, of course you make way, but in the same way, you make way also for a blind person coming. Well, in order to have an attendant, in order to have a litter or whatever it may be, you need some money. And every now and then this is also recognized by the ancient authors. This is what Plutarch has to say. And when his friends admonished him and told him that the possession of money, which he scorned, was a necessary thing, Nicodemus would say, yes, indeed. Pelopidas would say, yes, indeed, necessary for this Nicodemus here, pointing to a man who was lame and blind. So if you are in that condition, you're lucky, of course, to have money, because then you can afford some help. Now, the next fragment is a very interesting one. I know of at least 2 articles by ophthalmologists claiming that this is a reference to a guide dog. It's actually a short epigram you find with Marshall, saying, "The wallet asks that it carry not the beggarly lunch of a half-naked bearded one, nor sleep with a sour cane," says the Latin. Yeah? And some people have understood this as a sore dog, whatever that would mean. And they say, well, this is actually about a half-naked bearded beggar having a dog, which is just not the case. When you look at the commentaries too, a dog here means a cynic philosopher, being known for his poverty and so on and so on. So there's not really a guide dog here. A very special source, if you want to know about support and help for blind people, is a source which is even very difficult to date. It's the Pseudo-Herodotus, the Life of Homer, where it is actually said that Homer, according to this life, blind, when he arrived on the island of Chios, that he was just led by the sounds, the noises, and the backs also of goats. That is there. And there's also the strong connection between being blind and being a schoolmaster, being surrounded by children who sort of help you find your way. So as for human beings and animals, this is there in the life of Homer, but there's nothing said about a dog or a monkey. This is also interesting to think about. What about readers, lectores, but also slaves being called recitatores? There's a famous passage in the Tusculanae Disputationes by Cicero about a philosopher, Diodotos, a rich man versed in geometry, in literature, and so on and so on. Later in life, he became blind, but he was assisted by slaves who would just read aloud for him. And this is one of my favorite disabled people from antiquity, which brings us to late antiquity, of course, Didymus the Blind, who became blind at very young age. It was said that he sort of learned himself just by touching wax tablets and forms of letters and so on, just to read and write. But it's also told about Didymus the Blind that he was a highly skilled theologian, and that this happened also because people could just read aloud for him. Yeah? So I think that's also a thing to take into account. Also, when we mention bad vision or whatever, people not being able to read anymore, you could always find people, when you were rich enough, slaves, servants, reading aloud for you. And basically, much of ancient literature, as you all are aware of, was read aloud anyway. From the eyes, we move to the ears. Here I have to disappoint you, because as far as I know, and of course I'd be happy to be corrected, but as far as I know, there are no references to things like hearing trumpets, hearing aids whatsoever. The passage that comes closest is the one I cite in my book and that I cite for you here. It's in a satirical context, of course, end of the 1st century CE, Juvenal, saying as follows: "What difference does it make where he sits," about an old man, "where he sits in the huge theater if he can hardly hear the horn players or the fanfare of trumpets? The slave boy, puer, has to shout to make his ear hear his visitor's name or what time it is." So you have a slave shouting in your ear, and he's the only one who can sort of help you. This is, of course, like the topos of the sadness of old age. Right. Let's move on to the face and the mouth. Well, this is a thing I discovered just some years ago, and which gave me the possibility to immerse myself also in the Byzantine sources, which are kind of intriguing for this. It has been said constantly that Emperor Justinian II had a prosthetic nose made out of gold, and that because his tongue had been extracted, he also made use of a mouthpiece. Now, what is this? First of all, for the golden nose, I have to say that there are parallels even about the first successors of the Prophet Muhammad, which would be about the same time, and that there are quite some indications that people were indeed able to make a prosthesis out of sort of metal, gold, iron, silver, whatever, in cases of the so-called rhinocopia, so when your face was mutilated by cutting off your nose. You don't really find this in depictions of Justinian. Some say that this coin, well, that the nose is actually resembling a golden nose. I'm not too sure of that. Now, the other thing is funny, just funny thing, but you should remember this when you discuss things like this. So in a book which was published in Dutch, the author claims that Justinian uses a mondstuk, something like this, or even a spreekbuis. Spreekbuis translates as a mouthpiece. Now, when I saw this, of course, I wanted to see the sources. This is never mentioned, never. And then I wrote the author, whose name I will not mention now, and he said, well, I didn't mean to say so. Spreekbuis in Dutch can also mean a person speaking for you. Right, okay, which is of course very different. But even then, when you read about the second reign of Justinian II, he's speaking, he's speeching. So, of course, the glossotomia happened, but perhaps in one way or another, he was still able to speak, which according to physicians is possible. So there is no clue whatsoever on mouthpieces being used for that, but you will find it on websites. My message would be, please always go to the sources to check this. Right. Now, what about mobility impairment? First of all, I want to mention the name of my dear student Anne Fordham, who wrote an excellent thesis last year at the University of Manchester with me, master's dissertation, which was called A Sign of Weakness or a Sign of Strength, which actually is about the staff and crutches in antiquity. And the interesting thing is that Anne herself is a medical doctor, a general practitioner who has like an experience, I think, of more than 40 years in medicine. So that made it very interesting also to work with her. Well, I just show you some famous instances on the left, of course, from a frieze of the Parthenon, where you see Hephaestus depicted. And when you look carefully, I will just use my cursor here. When you look here at his right arm, so for us at the left, you still see the crutch, which is here, because as you all know, according to a certain tradition, Hephaestus was facing difficulties while walking. Now, the interesting thing is that there is a whole tradition of anecdotes, stories, and so on kings walking with pain, whom we would call war veterans. There's a beautiful article by our French colleague Evelyn Samama on this. And I checked all the references again. For some of these kings, the most famous, who is of course Philip of Macedonia, it is never mentioned. that he would have walked with a staff or a crutch. Now, of course, I had to insert this slide because Maria and George put this already in the announcement of my talk. And this is the famous passage which brings us to the beginning of the 5th century BCE in Herodotus, mentioning this divine seer Hegesistratos. And well, actually the clue of the story is that he is captured, that he just cuts off his own foot, and that in this way he manages to escape from the Spartans and took refuge in Tegea. And I just put in bold the important things for us here. So when his wound was healed, he procured himself a wooden foot and became an open enemy to Sparta. At the last, however, this enmity brought him to trouble, for the Spartans took him captive as he was exercising his office in Zakynthos, which is again very interesting, because when you read, for instance, Pliny the Elder, there will be mention of a man having an iron hand, Marcus Sergius Silius, who was sort of reproached of being part of sacrifice, and some of his opponents saying, you can't actually do this with his prosthesis. Now, it seems to be the case that Hegesistratus, with his wooden foot, could still be part of office. Now, of course, this needs to be Jane's lecture, so I'm not going to elaborate upon this. Just say you that when you browse through ancient Greek and Latin literature, you will actually find 2 instances of wooden feet. I just mentioned the one by Hegesistratus. There's the one, the famous one about which there are many articles on the iron hand, and there's also one in Martial on a wooden leg. More is to be found, I'm sure about that, in Christian hagiographical records. In an article I published in 2011 on disabled children with Gregory of Tours, I mentioned 2 more instances of wooden legs, that is. So I'm sure that there are still things to be found. And of course, there's much to be found in archaeology. One can only think about the famous grave in Capua, which is explained in great detail also in the book that you see here again, edited by Jane Draycott. Now, what other help would there have been for people with mobility impairment? Well, of course, there is something with wheels. It's not exactly a wheelchair, but it's what is called in Latin a plaustrum, something like a wagon. So this is Aulus Gellius, who was always interested in all these little details, reflecting on the law of the 12 tables, which brings us to the mid of the 5th century BCE, actually saying that when somebody, because of his being unable to walk, could not come to court, well, he had to be helped. He had to be furnished with a plaustrum, with a wagon. Plautus, in one of his commentaries, says, it's no use. As if I were lame, Claudius, I have to walk around with a cane. This is fusti in Latin. And then one of my favorite speeches of antiquity, which brings us to the end of the 5th century BCE. It's about a pension being granted to a person who is supposed to be facing difficulties with mobility, and then there's doubts about him getting this pension or not. He's kind of defending himself, and he will say, well, I ride a horse. And because of that, you would say that I'm not mobility impaired, but of course I am. And I'm poor. If not, I would have been riding on a saddled mule, which would have been so much more comfortable. And then, just read please this, I would say, sophistic argument he uses. So they're actually reproaching me that I use 2 sticks, while others use 1. But this is, of course, not an argument, because then what would you say? If you use 2 sticks, you are kind of less disabled than the person who has just 1 stick. Of course not. So the same counts for the horse and the mule. So don't ever say you're using a horse, you're less disabled. What a strange and what a sophistic argument that is, but you can read it with Lysias and it says something about riding animals at least. These are beautiful fragments which bring us to the tragedy writers, and these are really cases of what anthropologists have called sort of symbiosis. There is a fragment in tragedy also where blind Oedipus will say about Antigone, "You have become my eyes." And there is a fragment in Euripides about Oedipus's sons being dead, his wife also being dead. Your wife is not here anymore. Your wife who toiled in caring for you and like a staff, tended your blind footsteps. And then about Antigone, then you shall never more walk with the aid of these 2 props, skeptroin, with a beautiful dualis form in Greek here, but Sophocles or Oedipus will go on explaining that Antigone is actually like his staff, his support in his walking around as a blind person. There are some remarkable and funny stories also to be found in the inscriptions of Epidaurus. I will only tell you one. So this is really described on the inscription. There's a man who comes to the sanctuary using crutches. He's just sitting on a chair. A young boy comes, steals the crutches. At this moment, he's saying, "Hey, don't take my crutches." So he's just jumping up. He's running because he wants to catch the thief. And from then on, he's just able to walk. And there are other miracles like this. It is always about people coming with crutches, to the sanctuary of Epidaphros. And of course, for studying things like this, we need to study the Gospels too. The story I refer here to is about the healing of the so-called paralytikos, as it is said in Greek. And in 2 of the versions, with Mark and with Luke, you will actually see that the attendants of the so-called lame person cannot reach Jesus Christ because there's too many people around him. What will they do? So the paralytikos is actually carried around on a litter, on a stretcher, and they will just bring him to Jesus by lifting him up, reaching the roof, and then just letting him down from the roof, because otherwise they could just not get hold of Jesus. So here you have people helping, of course, and here you have the idea of, well, sort of mattress even on which he is lying. There has been some talk this summer about an article I refer to here. You will find the link also in one of the illustrations that was used. So the article basically states that in many temples, sanctuaries, you will find ramps, and this might have possibly been to grant access to people with mobility impairment. I think this is a fair possibility, absolutely. And I would also like to refer to research by, for instance, Emma Jane Graham, who has studied also possibilities of access for people to sanctuaries and how difficult every now and then it was for them just to reach these places. And well, basically there are lots of things to do with this archaeology, as they call it, of landscapes. Right. As I promised to George and Maria, I would just talk for about 40 or 45 minutes, which means that I have reached the conclusion now. I would say that people in antiquity mostly just tried to make the best out of it. So when people are facing difficulties, there are things that can help you. If you can't walk, you can be put indeed on a cart, on a wagon. People can carry you around. If it's less worse, you can use crutches or staffs or whatever. Yeah? Blind persons could be guided, and so on and so on. Now we always want to know, and this is of course from our also point of view, which includes revalidation, technology, and so on. We always want to know about the prima causa, the first thing that was there, the first wheelchair, the first guide dog, and so on and so on. But I would say that the ancients would have found this a rather strange question. Life was just as it was, and whatever could be of help might have been used. Just today, I was in contact with a colleague from Tampere in Finland, and she showed me an early 15th century source, a hagiographical source, about a blind person who is accompanied by a dog. And then again, there's these discussions, would that be the first instance of a guide dog? I'd say that you can imagine throughout centuries some people knowing that this animal can help you and making use of it. Yeah? So my point would be that the massive use of these instruments, of technology, of prosthetics also, is very much a 19th century development. I know that for hearing aids and so on, you already find it in the 16th century also, 17th century. So when we go to the age of enlightenment already, when disability, according to me, becomes something like a social problem already. But I would say that surely that technology to help these people belongs to a modern system of diagnosing, labeling, remedying individuals who are kind of existentially approached as the disabled. Surely in these nations, which exist from the 19th century on, who all want to have, between quotation marks, of course, healthy citizens. And then it becomes important to help people and to increase technology to help them, and so on and so on. So that would be my kind of basic and perhaps a bit casual conclusion, but nevertheless, I hope that this lecture offered you some things to think about, some nice anecdotes also, and some food for discussion. By the way, if you would be interested in more, so together with my PhD student in Manchester, Lisa Brunet, I run the Disability History in the Ancient World website. You can always have a look there, and the book that George so kindly mentioned in the beginning, in the introduction, that came out with Cambridge University Press, is also on this slide. Thank you for listening.
Christian, thank you so much. That was wonderful. It's very interesting material, and it helps to raise some very important questions. Before we move to questions and discussions, Jane will respond, and then we'll open the floor.
Thank you very much, Christian. That was fascinating. I have a slightly different opinion about the relationship between disability and technology. I mean, I agree with you that we trying to superimpose our modern understanding of impairment and disability and the way that impairment and disability functions in our society. Trying to sort of superimpose that onto antiquity doesn't work at all. And I think one of the things that we as scholars of impairment disability need to think about a lot more is the way that our understanding of impairment and disability today is very much informed by medicine, as you said in your closing section. And the approach that I suppose I'm speaking pure as a British person living in Britain. I can't obviously speak for elsewhere in the world, but the emphasis is very much on a person with a disability being included and integrated into society as a child in education, as an adult in the workplace, etc. They receive a certain amount of assistance, financial and otherwise, to do that, but the onus is very much on them specifically to do it themselves, and the help that is afforded to them is perhaps not as much as they might need, but the aim of the sort of the medical aim, I suppose, of intervention in mental and physical impairments is ultimately to allow somebody to live independently, to be able to look after themselves and do things for themselves. And that's when you have an accident, you go through rehabilitation. The purpose of that is to get you back to where you were before, or as close as you can be before. You have to, if it's a permanent physical impairment, it's relearning how to do everything that you could previously do, but in a different way. And the key difference, I think, for our contemporary understanding of disability and this sort of thing, and the problem that perhaps we encounter when approaching antiquity, is that people tend to forget about slaves. Because as you said, looking at the passage about Pliny, slaves are everywhere in antiquity, but the only time they're actually explicitly mentioned is when there is a reason to mention them. They say or they do something surprising or important. And I think we need to bear in mind, when we're talking about impairment and disability in antiquity, generally speaking, you were never alone in antiquity. You were always surrounded by, if you were poor, family members. If you were wealthy, family members and household members such as slaves. You did not dress yourself. You did not bathe yourself. You didn't necessarily even feed yourself. You had people doing that for you. So we have to think a lot more about what exactly the sort of day-to-day business of being disabled in antiquity meant, because the way that we would think about people with disabilities today is though they can't do this the way that a non-disabled person can. They can't do that. In antiquity, everybody is getting extreme assistance for the most mundane tasks. So that's one thing. But then I think, as far as technology is concerned, I mean, if we think about, rather than thinking about human technology in the form of slaves, I think I have this is where I sort of slightly disagree with you. I think I have a lot more. I've seen a lot more evidence for the actual tangible application for technology as a way of ameliorating the sort of problems that mental or physical impairment can cause. So I having sort of worked on sort of the assistive technology side of ancient impairment disability. So in my view, we see a consistent linking of disability and technology from prehistory, from like the earliest days of mythology. We have Hephaestus, who is the impaired god, who is creating assistive technology for himself and others. And it's not just in Greek and Roman mythology. We see that in Norse mythology as well. There is this sort of general sort of impaired gods of technology using their godlike powers to create technology. And we see this with ordinary individuals as well. Disabled individuals tend to undertake technical professions, partly out of the practicality of it, I suppose. You are able to stay in one place and work on sort of certain things, and you know, if you've got certain sorts of skills in one area, that's valued by your community. And I see trajectory of disability actually informing the development of technology. So, you know, you see Hippocrates tells us, for example, that the Amazons deliberately disabled their male children and put them to work as artisans. And while that's a sort of hearsay, folklore-y kind of story, I think we have seen sort of archaeological evidence of artisan trades like smithing actually having negative effects on an individual's body and impairing them gradually. So I think that disabled artisans would use their experiences to inform their technology. But we also see existing types of technology being adapted for disability. So I don't think it's a coincidence that Marcus, who has the iron hand, is a soldier. Because a lot of our evidence for these sorts of assistive technologies comes from military contexts, I think it's fair to say that military artisans, blacksmiths, woodworkers, etc., are using their skills in making armor, adapting them to make assistive technology. And I think there is a lot of sort of the problem with disability, which I'm sure you'll agree, and anyone else who's looked at the subject, is that there isn't one ancient canonical source about it. You have to kind of go sifting through hundreds and hundreds of sort of shorter fragments, and you showed us some of them, and it's very much just potluck whether you will find the source. The Aelian one is fantastic. I mean, I recently found a reference to Cleopatra having a dancing monkey that would wear a mask and imitate performers, and so clearly monkeys are sought after for their imitation. But yes, anyway, so I didn't know about that one. So yes, I think we need to think, as well as thinking of the contribution of slaves, I think we do need to think a lot more carefully about the contribution of technology, and the fact that because ancient authors don't tend to talk about technology very much, because our ancient authors are predominantly elite people, they aren't interested in technology unless it's kind of fabulously amazing rather than every day. So yes, I will stop talking now and just say that I think going forward we need to think a lot more about humans and a lot more about technology. That could potentially be our sort of going forward with the history of disability and antiquity. And yeah, thank you once again for your talk.
Well, thank you.
Thank you, Jane. Before we open the discussion, Christian, would you like to make a couple of comments on Jane's?
Yeah, yes, of course. Thank you so much, Jane. I'd say that I could not agree more. So first of all, for the thing of everybody being assisted and so on and so on, this is the thing I've tried to stress very much in my presentation here, that absolutely we need to think about these slaves being everywhere. And by the way, I'm sort of preparing a short note or article on just what readers and recitatores and lectores actually did. There's fascinating material there. I'd say that, of course, we need to take into account, this is obvious, and we would agree with this, that this only counts for those who had slaves. So, of course, what did you do when there were no slaves available? But I agree for 100% that we have to take into account these human beings. I also found your remark on being independent very interesting. Why? Because I'm currently also working on a volume on the very difficult topic of intellectual disability. And there I came across some anthropological literature saying, like, we often think about, oh, these poor people, they can't be independent and so on and so on. Could they live on their own? But the whole idea of being independent is, of course, a very contemporary thing. And there's many societies in which people live in bigger families, and where you would stay and live with your parents or your relatives for the rest of your life. And this was just a common thing for many people. So perhaps it didn't matter at all that you just could not live for one reason or another independently. So that would be a point we can agree on too. Now, for the other thing, for the technology also there. So what I wanted to say in conclusion is that people just try to make the best out of it. And that includes, of course, the military context. That includes, for sure, Hephaestus. And, well, I think my book has lots of examples also of, indeed, disabled blacksmiths or people in one or another profession. So they really, well, they have to in a way too, but they sort of cope with circumstances and they make the best out of it. My point was more about that massive development of technology, and really that thinking, oh, we need to help that category of people who are then labeled as disabled. That this is a pretty recent thing, and that wasn't just there in antiquity, but I guess that we both agree on that. And for the rest, I'd say indeed we just have to search further and further for these adaptations and these things that were done just in daily life to accommodate life. Absolutely. So there's lots of things to discover on technology, and for that, we're also looking forward to your monograph, of course, on prosthetics. Absolutely. So I'd agree 400% there.